guys, it's Danny. Welcome to another episode from our Orchid Care for Beginners series. Today, we're gonna talk about dehydration in orchids yet again. Specifically, I'm gonna tell you the signs that you should look out for, which tell you your orchid needs more frequent watering. As we know, life can get very busy at times, and it's easy to forget that your orchid actually needs some water until you look at it and you think, this orchid didn't used to look like this, something's wrong. Well, very frequently what's wrong is that the orchid is getting dehydrated. So today I'm gonna give you 8 signs to look out for, which tell you your orchid needs more frequent watering. Today's video, together with our entire Orchid Care for Beginners series, is sponsored by rePotme.com, which offers you everything you could possibly need to properly take care of your orchid, from pots to potting mixes, fertilizers, pest control, accessories, and much more. If you're into bonsais, succulents, or African violets, they have something for you as well. So I'll link you their website down below. Feel free to visit them at any time. And I will also be sure to link you to my personal favorite products from rePotme that I use on a regular basis with my orchids. Alright, so before we start, I do want to clarify that when I say your orchid needs more water, I actually refer to frequency, not quantity. So it's not about offering a bigger quantity of water, but watering more frequent. And if you don't know exactly the technique of watering, I'll be sure to include some additional links down below. We do actually have an episode of how to water a Phalaenopsis orchid, and you can apply that to any orchid. Alright, so with that said, let's start with sign number 1, and I guess the most prevalent sign that your orchid needs more water. And this is limpy, wrinkly leaves, particularly with Phalaenopsis orchids. Now, plants actually breathe, and through the process of breathing, they lose water as well through the leaves. So when the quantity of water in the orchid decreases, you will not have plump, stiff, and healthy leaves. They will rather be floppy and wrinkly. It is one of the most intuitive signs, I would say. When you see your orchid has a lot of wrinkles in the leaves, and this is especially visible with Phalaenopsis orchids, you just know you have a dehydration issue. Now, mind you, we are presuming that your orchid has a good root system which is capable of absorbing water. If your orchid is rootless, then dehydration is a side effect of the fact that your orchid is rootless. So no matter how much you water it, it will not get hydrated. The orchid needs to put on new roots first. And again, I have a video related to rootless orchids, links down below. But just keep in mind that throughout this video, I do refer to orchids that have roots and can be hydrated. And the reason for dehydration is your frequency of watering. Now, luckily, this is easily fixable. If the leaf is not completely damaged through dehydration, it will return back to normal or very close to normal once your schedule becomes adequate yet again. So try to make sure that you look at the root system and you check the medium from time to time, and you increase a little bit the frequency of watering for that particular season or that particular environment in which you have your orchid. But definitely when you see limpy leathery leaves, that is a sign of dehydration, and it's easily fixable if your orchid has roots. Another very popular sign of dehydration is wrinkly pseudobulbs. Now, Phalaenopsis don't have pseudobulbs, but Oncidiums, Cattleyas, Dendrobiums, they do. And because they don't have such fleshy leaves, it's really hard to see when their leaves become a little limpy. So what we do is look at the pseudobulbs. On these orchids, pseudobulbs need to be plump unless they have a natural pattern or some ridges. But typically, when a pseudobulb stops being plump and you will see very evident wrinkles, that is a sign of dehydration. On these orchids, pseudobulbs are storage devices. They will have nutrients and water stored in there. So when the reserve of water is low, you will first see it on the pseudobulbs, not the leaves. So again, in this case, things can be resolved, and I do get a lot of comments asking me if the pseudobulbs will ever become plump again. Yes, they will. They might not be super glossy and pretty as in the beginning, depending how much they got dehydrated. But typically, once the orchid rehydrates, yes, those pseudobulbs will become plump again. You might still see a few little wrinkles, but nothing like a raisin, which they can start to look like if they get severely dehydrated. Yet again, I'm referring to orchids that do have a good root system. Orchids that don't have roots will tend to shrivel up a lot, but even those will plump back up when new roots are being created and start to absorb water and hydrate the orchid. So, if you will, with these orchids, the pseudobulbs are a sort of barometer when it comes to water. And if you're not sure about the frequency of watering with these orchids, you can wait until you see tiny little wrinkles on the pseudobulbs. When you see them, you know it's a good time to water. What you shouldn't do is let the pseudobulbs become raisin-like. That's the best way that I can put it. Another sign that your orchid might get dehydrated is wrinkly roots. And this is especially visible on monopodial orchids like Phalaenopsis and Vanda orchids because these guys don't have those pseudobulbs to store water. So what they do is they store some water in the leaves and in the fleshy roots. So when an orchid gets dehydrated, you will start to see some wrinkles even in the roots. Now, mind you, aerial roots can be wrinkly, and that's absolutely fine. If you choose to spray them from time to time, that's okay. But if you have potted roots which look in perfect condition, that is absolutely okay for the orchid. It doesn't really mean that the orchid will get dehydrated. It's just that the aerial roots can actually get a little bit dry. However, if you see wrinkly roots inside the pot, then that is an issue. It means you are not watering frequently enough and the roots get severely dehydrated. Hence, the orchid will get severely dehydrated as the reserve runs low. So try to not let these roots become very wrinkly. Yet again, if you see just the tiniest bit of wrinkling, that is okay. Just an indication that you should water, but do try not to let them become, again, raisin-like. That is actually not healthy for the tissue, and severe dehydration can destroy tissue, be it roots, leaves, or pseudobulbs. Now let's go on to the more dramatic signs. A dehydrated orchid can actually put on pretty crinkled and distorted leaves, and this is especially the case with dendrobiums, generally, but not only. Oncidiums and oncidium type orchids can actually obtain accordion-like leaves. Phalaenopsis will not necessarily be prone to this, but at least when it comes to dendrobiums, things can get very dramatic. So dramatic that the leaves cannot even open properly. If the orchid doesn't have enough water in its system, it cannot actually stretch out those leaves. So when you see these signs, especially on your dendrobium orchids, first I would definitely check the root system, make sure that it's in good order, and if it is, definitely it is a problem with the frequency of watering. Typically, dendrobiums will need more watering in their growing seasons, which are spring, summer, and autumn. As their pseudobulbs mature, they require a lot of fertilizer and a lot of watering in comparison to the resting season for some of them. So make sure that in these seasons you are adequately watering them. Make sure the medium is not going bone dry for a lot of days. And if you see these crinkly and misshapen leaves, definitely 99% of the times it is a watering issue, easily fixable. These leaves will not look perfect again, but the newer leaves which will grow will look better and better. So do try to stay a little bit more on top of watering. Now here's an even more dramatic sign: yellowing and falling of buds. Now, we did recently talk about bud blast and what causes it, and one of the causes was stress. Well, dehydration is one of the biggest stresses your orchid can actually go through, big enough to set it back for even years, depending on the severity. So it's pretty understandable that under water stress, orchids will try to shed anything that takes up way too much energy. Flowers and buds and flower spikes in general, they are some of the most energy-consuming structures orchids can produce because they're just so intricate and elaborate. They have different colors. Some orchids are super strongly scented, not to mention the whole shape of it. So they're so complex and they don't give anything back to the orchid. They don't photosynthesize. They don't absorb water. That all they are expenses, quote unquote, for the orchid. So they are amongst the first structures to go in case of serious water stress. Now, causes might vary, and if you're not sure why an orchid can actually lose buds, I'll make sure to link you to that video down below, but definitely watering and dehydration is something you should look into, and make sure that you're watering your orchid enough. There are some orchids, such as neophoenicias and hybrids, which are actually known to lose their buds in case you don't keep them watered enough. So do look into that. It is definitely another sign of dehydration you should know about. The good news is that if your orchid is healthy and has roots, once you adjust the watering regime, you shouldn't have any more bud blast and your orchid should bloom beautifully. Another sign, which might not be as common, but definitely it's a sign, is soft flowers. And here I'm not referring to flowers which are about to fade, they're drying out, they're falling. Not that sign, actually limpy and very soft flowers. And this is very common with phalaenopsis that have very big flowers. Sometimes you can wake up with all of the flowers on the flower spikes just being soft and dangling in the wind. They don't look like they are yellowing and falling one by one. They all look rather soft. Well, typically this is a sign of dehydration, so I would definitely check the pot, the medium, and the root system to see if it is wet enough, and if it's bone dry, water the orchid immediately, because it's not going to take long until those flowers will actually really become dry and fall. Typically, if you get to the orchid in time and the tissue is not destroyed on the flowers, you will rehydrate the flowers. It takes a few hours, up to a day, for an orchid to become visibly hydrated. So if you're in luck, you will be able to enjoy the flowers for many more weeks to come. But if not, don't be surprised if the flowers will eventually yellow and fall. So especially when orchids are in bloom, it is important to maintain them hydrated, because we do want to enjoy the blooms for as long as they last, and some orchids really don't have long-lasting blooms. If you add the stress of not watering, the orchids will stay in bloom even less, which is not something we want. Many orchids are very tolerant and they can withstand a lot of time not being watered, but when they're in bloom, they typically consume more water, and typically you would want to pay a little bit more attention to them not to lose the flowers. One of the worst signs of dehydration is yellowing and falling of the older structures, be them pseudobulbs or leaves. In the case of phalaenopsis, the older bottom leaves might start to fall excessively if the orchids do not receive enough water and they become stressed. And this is because the orchid is pulling energy from those older structures to feed the newer structures, which are more important. But the idea is to not let an orchid resort to that. That is a defense mechanism which ensures new growth has resources. Luckily though, there are many other signs before we reach this stage, but this is what can happen if dehydration is left to continue and you don't address your regime in time for the orchid to recover. And finally, stunted growth or setback. Setback is visible as smaller and smaller new growths, the inability to bloom, and overall just very poor look of an orchid. And by the way, this is an orchid that I had in a terrarium mounted which was not wet enough, so it got dehydrated. So as a result of all of that stress, orchids simply don't have enough energy to produce normal growth. So they will try to put on smaller and smaller growth, stunted crowns, very small leaves, very small pseudobulbs, which are not even able to bloom. So the idea is to avoid this last stage by trying to look for the other signs that I talked about, because the next step from here is not gonna be pretty. It's pretty much the slow demise of an orchid. So be sure that you look at your orchid every so often. If you don't have time to inspect your orchid every day, maybe every few days, just look at it when thinking about watering, when you wonder if your orchid actually needs water. You don't necessarily need to look at the medium if you don't have time, just look at the leaves and the structures, and that typically will tell you if you have to water or not. So these were the 8 signs of underwatering, as they say. I prefer to stay away from terms such as overwatering and underwatering, because for some people it can be very confusing, especially for people who are not native English speakers. It doesn't really make sense to us when we try to translate it. So it refers to frequency rather than quantity, provided you do a correct watering. So I hope this video is useful for you. What I'm gonna do is water my little orchid here as well, because yeah, life got a little bit busy for me as well. I didn't water this orchid and look at it. Very clear signs of dehydration, right? So thank you so much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you rePotme for sponsoring yet another episode of our Orchid Care for Beginners series. Hope you all have a great day. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, updates, and other fun orchid subjects. If you wish to support the channel, do consider becoming a member or visit the merch store linked down below in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. It's always nice to stay in touch there as well. And with that said, I'll see you next time. Bye!